Hi, Mr. Lunsford here. We had quite a few students miss a few days here when we went through the Macroeconomics 101 Notes Part 2. So I thought I'd make a quick video kind of giving all the notes and the things that I would have said in class in one place so you don't get too far behind. And I'll try and keep this as short as I can. I'm using 8th period's group notes for no reason other than those are the ones that I already had up. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to try and do this in one take so that we don't have to cut this together. And let's go ahead and get started. So group one here is talking about the federal government and how economics works at the federal level. It starts on page 566. If you want to do that. And we're going to kind of start with where the money goes that we pay to the government and the different areas that the government spends a lot of that money on. So the first thing, federal government policy influences the economy. The government does spend more than $2 trillion a year, and that seems like quite a bit of money, and it definitely is. Our national debt's currently around 19 trillion, just over 19 trillion. So $2 trillion a year. It's quite a bit of money, and it's spent on a lot of things, including the national debt, direct benefit payments, which are payments to things like Social Security or Medicare, those social insurance taxes that we talked about in part one, national defense costs. Those include things like the military, scientific research for those military and government agencies, including the FBI, CIA, and then discretionary spending. I used an example in class of the TV show Law and Order. And before every episode, it has a little statement and it says viewer discretion advised. And what they're saying there is that the viewer should decide whether this is the best thing for them or whoever's watching it with them to be watching this show. And discretionary spending works in the same manner. It's basically the government deciding that our money is going to be best spent for whatever activity. So it's the government kind of deciding the best place or the best thing for society and how to spend that money to do so. A significant portion of the budget goes to Social Security. It's about $500 million just for Social Security, as well as social welfare and healthcare programs. And again, those are direct benefit programs. And those total about $960 billion, yes, with a B, billion of the $2 trillion that we spend. And these three programs for pretty close to a half, which, 960 billion, really close to that 2 trillion number that we've been spending. And to move right along to group two here, national defense was the biggest expense in World War II. Obviously, this was a huge conflict. It involved all of the world. But after World War II, Ronald Reagan was president, and he made the Defense Department a little bigger. And he thought that we needed to invest more money in our military for the equipment and for training, because after World War II, or more accurately at the end of World War II, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan that sort of ended the World War in the Pacific front. After that happened, the world kind of took a step back and said, wow, those did a lot of damage. And everyone was sort of like, the US has these, we need these, Russia being the main opponent there. And what started was the Cold War. So we invested a lot of this money to sort of develop those weapons even further. And when the Cold War was coming to an end, and George H. Bush is president, that's Bush 41, he eliminated most of those nuclear weapons because we wanted to kind of say, hey, we need to back off. We need to do this. This is a mutually assured destruction, which means if we fire, you fire, and everyone dies. And we didn't want that to happen. So after George W. Bush came Bill Clinton, the 42nd president, and they decided to reduce that budget for defense and to basically not spend all this money building nuclear weapons and strategic bombers around the clock. But by 2000, people felt that we were not spending enough on defense. So despite the fact that we had just cut defense, people said we need to spend more. And President George W. Bush, that's Bush 43, basically launched a campaign to spend more in the military. And in 2001, the budget increased to 11 billion, and this is prior to the 9/11 attacks. Right after those 9/11 attacks, they increased by 81 billion. So we were spending around 530 billion. In 2001, it raised to 541-ish billion. And then in 2003, we jumped up to over 600 billion to the mark where we are today, about 610 billion. So it's quite a bit of money. And if you think about it, we're spending 960 billion on those direct benefit payments. We're spending about 610 on the military defense. So that's 3/4 of our budget right there, right off the top. The federal government spends most of its large tax revenues on the environment, criminal justice, and a lot of other areas. Most of the federal government's discretionary spending is for the states and other local governments. What that means is the federal government will go to a state and say, hey, here is some money to put together a program or to fund a library or to maintain state roads, okay? All kinds of things. And it can even go to things like education and flood insurance for those people that did not have the insurance during times of local disasters or natural disasters even. This would be more common in places that are near the coast or California with earthquakes, and it would be more tornado insurance in our area here in Ohio. State and local governments do rely quite a bit on the federal government's grants for revenue. Basically what grants are is the states and local governments would apply to the federal government and say, hey, we want some money to do this program, build a playground, let's say. But in 1980 to 1989, those federal grants sort of declined because we were spending more money on defense. While the number of federal grants that are being given out has increased a little bit, majority of the money that would have been spent on grants prior to that time is now being given to states to use for various programs, sometimes even public welfare programs. So now we're going to move on to fiscal and monetary policy. Sometimes these two things get confused as the same thing, but please make sure that you understand monetary policy and fiscal policy are two totally separate things. So our federal government has sort of taken on more of a role in the nation's economy, which is, how our money functions, the market, people selling things, people buying things. And people continue to disagree over how much of a role the government should play in our economy. So we have sort of two different organizations. We have the federal government, which is usually in charge of the fiscal policy, and we have the Federal Reserve System, commonly known as the Fed, which is going to be in charge of our monetary policy. So let's go ahead and jump in. Let's start with fiscal policy. Federal budget is a major tool of fiscal policy because fiscal policy is the money that we spend. It's the money that the government spends or collects through taxes. And they can shape the economy simply by spending more money. If the government spends more money on different programs, that could stimulate the economy. Or if they collect less money in taxes, it gives more money to people to put in their pocket and to spend in the economy and sort of stimulate it and get it rolling. Sometimes they can tax more, and that could slow the economy down because that's less money in people's pockets, okay? So the difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy is sort of minor, but it's a big thing to make sure that you understand. So fiscal policy, again, we're spending, we're taxing to influence the economy. Monetary policy is controlling how much money is in circulation. So how much money is available, and the credit, meaning the ability to loan money or how much it costs to loan money and whether we're going to loan money at all. All right. So please make sure you understand monetary policy is the supply of money. Fiscal policy is spending it, taxing it. Now the government can increase spending or reduce taxes. And when they do that, it's very likely that they're going to run on a deficit. And since the 1930s, we've run on a deficit most of the time. And a reason that we've decided to run these deficits, is to benefit the economy. So spending a good deal of money can usually lead to a deficit, and we know that deficits lead to national debt. So these increasingly large deficits and the increasing number of deficits were adding a significant amount of money to our national debt. But we were doing so in an attempt to get the economy rolling, to sort of boost our economy and get it to a level that we felt comfortable with. But economists were worried that having these multiple deficits in a row, contributing to a large national debt, could have an adverse effect or a very bad effect on our nation in the future. So people began demanding that we start cutting the money that we're spending and not have such a great deficit. So people were really arguing for a balanced budget, which means we are spending either exactly as much as we are making, or we have a surplus, which is when you have money left over after all the money that you spent. And many argued that, if we did this, then the government wouldn't be able to affect the economy, and they wanted the marketplace to affect the economy. But one thing to keep in mind here is that in the United States, we have an enormous gross national product, and that should say product there, and it's commonly known as the GNP. And probably the best way to explain this is if we were to take anything and everything that was produced in the United States and any service that was given in the United States, including restaurants and servers, or mechanics on vehicles, or teachers, or nurses, anything, everything, any service that's provided and any good that's produced, and we threw them in a big pile, that would be the GNP. Okay, so it's anything and everything that was produced, or any good or service, or any service that was provided. And when you look at our deficit in comparison to our gross national product, today it's only about 3%. And this says 5 to 6%, and that was correct when the textbook was written. It's actually closer to about 3%. So our gross national product is about $20 trillion. So I won't waste your time. We'll go ahead and do the math, but our deficit is about 600 billion. So in comparison, it's a very small number to our gross national product. For this reason, many economists said, hey, it's not a huge deal. As long as our deficit stays at this very low percentage of our gross national product, it's not something to be worried about. But there are other economists that argued that if we continue to do this, regardless of it's 1%, a tenth of a percent, we are still adding money to our federal debt. All right, so our debt was about $930 billion in 1933 under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In 2003, it reached, and this says here, $3,939 billion. That is not incorrect, but it probably should say 3.9 trillion. And currently today, our debt, like I've said earlier in this video, about $19 trillion. All right, so let's dive a little bit more into monetary policy, which again is controlling the amount of money that's available and the credit, and it can sort of impact the economy. So the main organization that controls monetary policy and how much money exists is the Federal Reserve System, commonly known as the Fed, and it is our central banking system in the United States. So when people or corporations need to borrow money, we go to a bank, whether that's for a car or a house or to start a business, anything and everything. But sometimes banks need banks. So when banks need money, they go to the Fed, which essentially makes the Fed a banker's bank. It's where a bank goes when it needs money. And there's a map here, and I placed it in the wrong group number here, so I'll scroll down very quickly after I explain this. But the United States is divided into 12 federal districts, and each has one main Federal Reserve Bank, and that's going to be the purple cities on the map when we take a look at it. And each branch banks within their district. So that city is going to be responsible for banking inside of their district and territory in some cases. About 5,700 of 13,600 banks in the U.S. are members of the Federal Reserve System. And these include almost all the large banks in the country. And member banks control a large portion or a large share of the total bank deposits in the U.S. And these are the major big player banks, U.S. Bank, Chase, PNC, those type of banks. All right. And here's the map I was talking about. Let's zoom in a little bit here. And maybe one more. All right, so as you see here, 12 total districts. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. They do increase from size starting in the east and moving to the west. And as you can see, these red lines are the boundaries of the federal districts. These blue lines inside of the districts separate them into territories. So let's take District 12 for an example here. A little bit of a Hunger Games reference there. So we see District 12 here, and it really encompasses a huge portion, kind of splits Montana a little bit, but it basically follows the line between Idaho and Montana down here through Wyoming, down to Utah, around Arizona, and all the way up the coast back to Washington. And it is split into a number of territories within. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. San Francisco, right here, is the Federal Reserve Bank. And all these other cities, Portland, Seattle, Salt Lake, and Los Angeles, are the branches of the Federal Reserve Bank. So they all report to San Francisco. So if we take a look here, Seattle is going to service this area in Washington. Portland, which is in Oregon, is going to service this area here, which is all of Oregon, and a little bit of Washington there, and even up into this portion of Idaho. And then Salt Lake City has got a good portion of Idaho, a little bit of Nevada here in Utah, Los Angeles, all of Southern California, a small portion of Nevada here, which is where where Las Vegas is found in Arizona. And then San Francisco has Northern California and most of Nevada, as well as Alaska and Hawaii. So this is how it's sort of broken out. Each Federal Reserve Bank has branches that service territories, and they're responsible for their respective areas. If you're curious, Ohio's over here in District 4. We have Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Cincinnati in our district. Pittsburgh services every part of Pennsylvania that is in District 4. Cleveland serves anything north of this blue line, and Cincinnati goes all the way down here, Lexington area, all the way down to Tennessee. And Springfield currently falls into the Cincinnati Federal Reserve branch. Cleveland is the Federal Reserve Bank of District 4. If you have any questions over that map, please feel free to ask me when you get back in class. If you're watching this as a review, feel free to ask me questions again. All right. So let's go ahead and move to Group 6. We're almost to the end. Board of Governors. So when we have something like the Federal Reserve System, we need somebody in charge of it. And the people that are in charge of the Federal Reserve System are the Board of Governors. They're a 7-member group in Washington, D.C., and they basically oversee the entire Federal Reserve System. And these people, just like Supreme Court justices, are selected by the president and then approved by the Senate. So yes, the president can really select whoever they want, whether they're qualified or not. But we really rely on our senators, people we've elected to represent us, to confirm the correct people. One of these members will be made a chairman, which is essentially the president of the Board of Governors. They serve a 4-year term. It changes so that we don't have the same person in power all of the time. The thing here is, once these people are appointed and ratified, the Federal Reserve System is almost totally separate of the federal government, and this is by design. This was to make sure that those governors that are appointed were not affected by political pressure like a politician might be. For example, lobbying. A company might hire a lobbyist who goes to certain political activity commissions, PACs or PACs, and says, hey, here's a bunch of money. And in exchange for that money, that politician might vote for something or vote against something that goes with or against that company. Money's a big thing in politics, and unfortunately, lobbying is a big part of that. So in order to prevent that lobbying system to be transferred over to the Federal Reserve System that can affect our economy in huge ways, we took out that political aspect. So the responsibilities of the governors are split really into 2 categories. The first of which is it basically oversees what those 12 reserve banks are doing. And remember, those are those purple cities on the map. And the reserve banks are in charge of those branch cities, those yellow ones that service those territories. And second, probably the most important here, is that it determines money supply and credit policies. So it decides how much money we're going to have out there and who we're going to loan money to. And they use three tools to do this. First of which, they can raise and lower the discount rate. And the discount rate, don't let it fool you, it's not something new. The discount rate is an interest rate that the Federal Reserve System charges those member banks, so like US Bank, PNC, and Chase, to take or borrow money from them. All right, so a discount rate is simply an interest rate that is charged to member banks to borrow money from the Federal Reserve. If they lower that discount rate, they make borrowing money cheaper. Then banks are more likely to borrow money. If they raise that discount rate, banks are less likely to borrow money. Okay, so that discount rate really is how much does it cost to borrow money. If the cost to borrow money is really low, they're going to be more likely to borrow it. If it's really high, they're going to be less likely to borrow that money. All right, and the last thing here, they have a reserve requirement. The Fed can raise or lower this reserve requirement. And one way to think of a reserve requirement is they go to those 12 branches and they say, hey, you have to keep X amount of dollars in reserve just in case. So picture it, taking $5 million in gold bars, throwing it in a safe. Then you get a call from the Federal Reserve System, Board of Governors. They say, hey, you got to up it to 10 million. So you put 10 million in. And then they say, oh, it's only $1 million. So now you take out 9 million and you've got $1 million in there. Okay, so it's the minimum that you are required to have if you're going to be a Federal Reserve Bank. And it's usually a certain percentage. It's not a dollar amount, but it's a little bit easier to explain if I do it that way. So they usually say, hey, 3%, a 4%, a 1%. All right. And if they lower that reserve requirement, meaning that banks have to keep less money in that reserve, then they're more likely to give it out because they have more money to give out. If the Federal Reserve System raises that reserve requirement and banks have to keep more money, they're less likely to give that money out, which can affect the economy. It can really boost it if they have more money to borrow. People are starting things, moving and shaking and doing all kinds of things. It can really slow it down if there's less money to borrow or if it's really expensive to borrow. The Fed can also put money back in the economy by buying security bonds, government bonds and securities on the open market. And open market is a place that exists where anybody and everybody can buy securities. And that includes citizens of foreign countries, citizens of the United States. That includes agencies of the United States itself, other foreign countries as themselves. Anybody and everybody can go there and buy bonds and securities. And this can really help expand the economy because buying and selling bonds and securities to investors gives the government that small loan that they are looking for. The thing here is the Federal Reserve can buy government securities themselves, but they can also sell those government securities to other people. So they're sort of the go-to person where they can buy them from the government and they can also sell them on behalf of the government. If investors spend a lot of money on securities, the economy is going to slow down because there's going to be money taken out of the system. If they don't spend as much on the security and that reserve requirement goes down a little bit, they're going to be more inclined to loan that money out to other banks who then loan it to other people pretty cheaply. Congress and President mostly control the taxing and spending, which is the fiscal policy field, but they really don't have much control over the Fed. And the Fed determines that monetary policy, again, the supply of money and how much it costs to borrow it. And since the Fed policy might help the presidential and congressional economic programs, for example, Congress can decide to spend a bunch of money on a certain program that they think will help bring jobs and allow people to start small businesses. The downfall of the Federal Reserve System being separate from the federal government is that they can raise that reserve requirement and make it hard for people to get loans, even though the federal government has spent money to get people to do that exact purpose. And this can counteract. It doesn't happen very often, but these kind of conflicts make people really question whether the Federal Reserve System should be totally separate from the federal government as an independent entity. And whether you think that or not, totally up to you. It is your opinion. And that's all I have for you. We're going to switch back to the Google Hangout here. There I am. All right. So Hopefully I kept it short enough for you and you enjoyed watching it, and I look forward to seeing you back in class.